In 1941, before the arrival of the feared war, the young Filipinos was exploring the complexities of life. After all, the Philippines is under the American tutelage, and it seems you have nothing to worry about. But this young Filipino didn't know that they will soon a hero who will defend this country. Good day, Dash 2. We have the honor to present to you the story of the most significant event in our nation's history. Let's explore the sacrifices and learn the true essence of heroism. May the courage and sacrifice continue to inspire us for generations to come.
Before the end of the peaceful and nostalgic era in the 1941, life in the Philippines was beautiful, carefree, and under American tutelage. The people were filled with hope and promise for a better future. Young Filipinos pursued their dreams and enjoyed the beauty of their surroundings. Many watched the soldiers of the 31st Infantry Drill, also known as the 31st Infantry, as they were known for drinking Ginebra gin. This was one of the reasons why many soldiers wanted to be assigned in the Philippines, as it was considered good living for a soldier. The government was efficient with no graft or corruption, and the promise of independence was only 5 years away.
After the US opposed the Japan in invading China, it became clear that these two military powers were in a collision course because of the Japanese considers hitting US bases around the world and making the Philippines an obvious target.
Despite many people believed that America was firm, Japanese never challenged their power. It gave false sense of security to Filipinos. However, the Philippine Commonwealth prepared defense plans under General Douglas MacArthur. Young men are required to train to ROTC, which they use firecrackers to simulate firing and bamboo cannon as artillery.
July 1941. In July 1941, Japan already took the southern French Indochina. US responds sharply in freezing the Japan assets. General MacArthur was placed to command the USAFFE, or United States Army Forces of the Far East. In this date, it was the mark of the beginning for the Japan invasion. The commencement. On December 8, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on the large US naval base in Pearl Harbor. Within 6 hours, Japanese bombs had struck Baguio and Davao without warning. As a result, the US and the Philippines were dragged into World War II. Thousands of Filipinos volunteered with or without military training to defend our motherland. However, some were sent home due to the lack of weaponry. Those who were already in uniform built defensive positions on certain beaches where the Japanese might land. General MacArthur planned to stop the enemy, and these beaches became the front line. So in December 8, 1941, this was the time when the Japanese forces struck a surprise attack on Baguio and Davao without any warning. And a lot of Filipinos were sent to military, or they were sent to fight or defend even without proper training. But some were sent home because of the lack of weaponry.
Film defenders was a significant disadvantage on the first day of war. because most USFA planes was completely demolished by the surprise attack of the Japanese. And as the result, Philippine Air Force was severely weakened. Defenders became vulnerable to aerial attacks and hampering ability to launch counteroffensives.
The Japanese planes destroyed the United States Navy bases at Cavite. Filipinos and Americans flew outdated aircraft and heroically challenged the swiftly moving Japanese planes. Among the most courageous was Captain Jesus Villamor, the leader of the Villamor guerrillas. He and his men took outdated planes and guns, and they managed to shoot down 2 planes. The following week, in a raid on a Japanese airfield, he and his men took down 54 enemy planes. Due to his courageous and exemplary leadership, he earned the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military award. Because the Japanese were in control both in the air and the sea, the defense of the Philippines fell on the shoulders of ordinary foot soldiers, and many of them did not know what war was truly like.
The Japanese landed in Apari, Vigan, and Legazpi to destroy the airfields. General MacArthur initially thought it was a diversionary tactic and that their landing was intended to draw our military army from their main objective. However, in the end, this was not a tactic but it was their true motive. Because of that, MacArthur was forced to implement War Plan Orange, an old defensive plan that he had previously discarded. War Plan Orange involved a tactical retreat from their positions in Luzon to the Bataan Peninsula, where they prepared for a long-term defense. This strategy was used to deny the use of Manila and its strategic harbor, and the USAFE troops were expected to hold out until reinforcements arrived.
On the 2 days after the First War, 40 civilians in Bataan was seeking security. To prevent more casualties and damage to properties, General MacArthur declared Manila as open city, cleared with military personnel. On the other hand, President Manuel Quezon with his selected members of the cabinet moved in Bataan.
By the New Year's Day of 1942, all USFA troops had entered Bataan and were confident that reinforcement would arrive soon.
On January 2, 1942, Japanese occupied Manila.
General Masaharu Homo, commander of the Japanese 14th Army, and was given 50 days to conquer Philippines, but Homo knew if the US still hold the Bataan corridor, he would not accomplish his mission to buy time the defense of Bataan. USAF set up a length line of main road leading to Peninsula. The units of the length line was tasked to stall the Japanese advance, and they did in heroic fashion.
Major James Joseph Donovan. Major James Joseph Donovan was the commander of the 31st Infantry Regiment. He was tasked to stall Japanese advancements in Layak Junction. He and his men found a way to get rid of the Japanese army. He set the sugarcane field on fire, and Japanese came out there and they shot it. The 21st Division in Porac and 71st Division on Layak, supported by the Philippine Scouts artillery batteries, managed to slow down the enemy war machines. Sergeant Jose Calugas. Sergeant Jose Calugas at the station of Layak Junction sprang into action after one of his unit's gunners was hit by advancing Japanese tanks. He ran forward under enemy fire and single-handedly operated a 75mm cannon, directing a counterattack against the enemy despite being wounded. For his heroic actions, Sergeant Jose Calugas was awarded the Medal of Honor by the United States Congress, which is the highest military award.
After a long withdrawal to Luzon to Bataan, the defenders think it's time to face the Japanese squarely.
The first main line. The first main line in Bataan is stretched from Mauban in the west to Abukay in the east. Mauban was defended by the 1st Corps while Abukay was defended by the 2nd Corps. It was a battle between 80,000 Philippine soldiers against 60 Japanese troops. Despite outnumbering the Japanese, Allied forces were at disadvantage due to superior weaponry and tactics of the Japanese, as they are also in control of air and the sea.
Meanwhile, inside Manila Bay, Q-boats also distinguished themselves in action. In a half-hour air-sea battle between 9 Japanese planes and 2 Q-boats of Filipino-American forces, they managed to shoot down 3 Japanese planes despite being outnumbered. However, the 41st Division and other USA FFE units in the west of Mauban Line were unable to withstand the Japanese breakthrough. As a result, the Bataan defenders were forced to retreat to their second and final defense line in Orion and Baga.
The Bataan defenders faced a critical moment where they had to defend the Orion-Ibugak line at all costs. If the Orion-Ibugak line had been breached, it would have meant a failure of the Bataan defense as a whole. However, the Orion-Ibugak line proved to be a formidable obstacle for the Japanese, and because of that, the Japanese suffered heavy losses in their attempt to breach it.
Battle of the Points. Because they were unable to breach the Orion and Bagak line, General Homa ordered the Japanese to attack from behind the defensive positions. However, the Japanese troops were detected as they emerged from different points on the shore, resulting in their annihilation by the Bataan defenders. Captain Jose Tando, a Philippine constabulary captain who rose to the occasion, crawled to the enemy's bunker and threw a hand grenade, effectively killing the Japanese machine gunner. Tando's heroism helped us win what is now known as the Battle of the Points.
While the second line was being formed, the Japanese managed to break through, and because of that, the Japanese army catch up with their units in the other side of the line. The Japanese troops regroup and become threat to Bataan defenders, and it becomes jungle warfare, where you can hear the Japanese rifle, but you cannot see where they're shooting.
American tanks were deployed to crush the enemy inside the USAFFE line, but the thick jungle made it difficult to locate the Japanese positions. Thanks to eager troops from 11th Division came to the rescue and jumped on the top of the tanks and lead the tanks to help to pinpoint the enemies. Because of that, infiltrating Japanese was wiped out and it became we've known as the Battle of the Pockets.
Because Philem soldiers won both Battle of the Pockets and Battle of the Points, General Homa realizes his worst nightmare. It was mid-February 1942 when Bataan troops still holding their ground and Japanese troops suffered grievously.
(2,275) Japanese were killed and 4,049 were wounded. On the other hand, elsewhere in the Asia-Pacific region, the Japanese war machine conquered Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, and Singapore. Due to the high casualties and inability to break the U-SAF line, General Homa decided to pull back and wait for reinforcements, which led to a full 45 days.
Because they were unable to defeat the Bataan defenders through force, the Japanese resorted to propaganda in an attempt to break the spirit of the Filipinos and turn them against the Americans. They dropped leaflets featuring women and reminders of family, but despite these efforts, the morale of Bataan defenders remained high.
Remembering Erlinda. Defenders became more motivated when they hear about the story of Erlinda. She is a young Filipina raped and killed by the Japanese and became the cry of the files. Headquarters tried to boost morale further by broadcasting Voice of Freedom to Corregidor.
Norman Reyes was responsible for the English portion, while Lieutenant Francisco Isidoro handled the Tagalog translation. When the Bataan defenders heard the phrase, "a mile-long convoy on the way from the propaganda," their morale was lifted. The propaganda was aimed at convincing the soldiers to hold on to Bataan by promising a convoy of supplies from U.S. President Roosevelt.
But there's no convoy came. Pilam soldiers are not aware that US Gulf decided to help enemies. They had agreement to win in Europe first before making a move to Pacific. As the war passed by, shortage of food and medicine was experienced by the defenders. And to make the situation worse, 50% of the Philippine army was infected with malaria and unable to leave their foxholes. Medical battalions set up cemetery nearby and buried fallen comrades themselves.
As a result of challenging conditions faced by the soldiers, President Quezon wanted to gain independence for the Philippines so that he could call the Japanese and Americans out of the country. But President Roosevelt disapproved of these requests, and Quezon was sarcastically remarked, "How typical Americans to anguish over the fate of the distant cousin, while the daughter is being raped at a back room." Due to the Philippines being isolated and no longer safe, President Quezon and General MacArthur had to be evacuated from the country. Quezon was evacuated to the United States by a submarine, while General MacArthur left the Corregidor by a torpedo boat en route to Australia.
Just before leaving, MacArthur left this remarkable phrase, "I shall return." In the meantime, he called General Jonathan Wainwright to take over the command, and Major General Edward King was placed to command the Bataan forces.
Philippine soldiers gain recognition. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, praised the Filipino soldiers as the best warriors in the world, while Franklin Roosevelt, the US President, saluted the Philippines for upholding the most magnificent democracy. However, the troops needed more than a morale boost. They needed food, ammunition, and the air support, which never came. In contrast, the Japanese reinforcements were on their way and were determined to crush the defenders of Bataan.
April 1942. As April 1942 began, the use of troops were weakened by the hunger and the disease was still holding on. April 3, 1942, with fresh troops, the Japanese launched their final offensive on April 3, 1942, Good Friday. Their first goal was to capture Mount Samat. From this high ground, the Japanese could see and split the USAF lines, making the isolated Phil-American forces easy prey. Defenders were physically weakened, and Filipino and US troops were firing from their foxhole with their arms up to show that they wanted to fight. The Japanese kept bombing both the front line and rear position, attacking anything that moved.
Filipino-American soldiers planned a temporary defense line, but they were pushed back. The United States 31st Infantry Regiment and the units of the Philippine Scouts tried to counterattack, but they failed. Eventually, the front lines collapsed. General King decided to surrender the entire Bataan force with the assurance that the soldiers would be treated humanely. On Corregidor, The Voice of Freedom broadcasted the fall of Bataan.
The Death March. After the fighting ceased, Japanese was overwhelmed by the number of defenders they had captured. They formulated plan to gather prisoners and let them march from Maribeles to San Fernando, Pampanga. From there, prisoners would board cargo trains and be transported to Capas Tarlac, where they would embark a final walk to Camp O'Donnell Prison, this ordeal known as Death March.
Some prisoners never even made it through the Death March, but their fate was no less tragic. Over 400 U.S. officers were killed by the Japanese, who forced them to assemble at Bangkikan River and bayoneted them. Many POWs died due to dehydration. Townspeople along the route showed their support by throwing food and water to the prisoner and helping some to escape. At the San Fernando rail station, those who survived the march found out that their ordeal was far from over. The POWs were packed into train cars with no air, and some men died standing up with no room to fall down. More than 50,000 Filipinos and Americans are estimated to have died or escaped during the Death March.
Elsewhere in the archipelago, other Filipinos also continue to defy the Japanese. Among these courageous patriots was Supreme Court Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos, who refused to collaborate with the enemy. Despite being captured by the Japanese and offered a chance to be released in exchange for collaborating, Abad Santos refused to betray his country and his principles. He chose to stay with his fellow prisoners and was eventually executed by the Japanese.
The Fall of Corregidor. On night of May 5, 1942, Japanese finally launched invasion in Corregidor as they already controlled both the air and sea. Corregidor defenders still fired all in and inflicted heavy losses. On the other hand, hospital in Manila Tunnel was at risk, making General Wainwright forced to surrender in May 6, 1942. It was 27 days after Bataan fall. Corregidor POWs marched to City of Manila and sent to Bilibid Prison, joining Bataan POWs in Camp O'Donnell.
(1944) The fall of Bataan Corridor marked the end of organized resistance against the Japanese. But the guerrilla movement will continue the fight across the country, keeping the flame of patriotism alive. Many of these guerrillas were veterans of Bataan and Corregidor, who continually harassed the occupation forces. In those small measures, they paved the way for the triumphant return of General Douglas MacArthur and the Allied forces in 1944.
Bataan and Corregidor have been surrounded by historical myths for too long. Many tainted this symbol of Philippine bravery with the symbol of defeat, while others insist that those battles were all part of a war that we shouldn't have fought. But the fact remains that thousands of Filipinos, rich and poor, fought side by side against credible odds in the defense of a country.
This is legacy. This is the legacy that must not be forgotten. By their unity, courage, and sacrifices. The heroes of Bataan and Corregidor passed the torch of freedom and nationhood to all Filipinos, including you and me. By their example, they have shown that there is no force strong enough to extinguish that flame. Faced with any problem, we Filipino have the capacity to prevail it. I'm Dominic Bailon.
And I'm Carlo Felipe.
We are the Group 2. Thank you for watching.